I want to talk about something that's been coming up more and more in the last couple of years, and this is what I call temple technology. And it looks like the previous epoch used natural earth-based energy, geomagnetic energy, telluric energy. You talk a little bit about it in a couple occasions in the America Before book, but talk a bit if you have any thought on temples being built over telluric fields, and then
Yeah,
the temple itself being a benefactor for agriculture.
yeah. Well, I think it's a very good idea. I think it's very clear that the sites of many sacred sites around the world, the locations upon which they stand, were deliberately chosen because there's something special about those locations. And
Hmm.
you will often find that when a temple falls into disrepair, another temple is built on top of it. And when that falls into disrepair, another temple is built on top of that. The Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt is an excellent example of this, because the Temple of Horus, as we see it today at Edfu, dates from the Ptolemaic period, roughly, what, 300, 280 BC, relatively recent, in other words. But it turns out that it was built on the foundations of a much older temple, which in turn was built on the foundations of an even older temple. And in the texts written on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, we find an account of this. We find that they preserved archives from these former temples, archives that had been written on animal skins that were falling into disrepair, and that they copied these archives onto the walls of the temple that we see today in order to make them more permanent, to make sure that they would last into the future. And it's fascinating, although the current incarnation of the Temple of Horus at Edfu is Ptolemaic. The form of the Egyptian language that is used in those texts is way pre-Ptolemaic. It's Middle Egyptian. It dates back to 2000 BC plus.
Hmm.
And clearly they are attempting to preserve and pass on to the future a very ancient message, which was ancient even in 2000 BC.
Yeah. I want you to touch
But
on.
to come back to your point, Cliff, to come back to your point, um, part of the arrogance of our civilization today, it's shared by the arrogance of archaeology, the notion that somehow we know everything and that the ancients knew nothing. So you'll find that most people who define themselves as scientists are extremely dismissive of and hostile to any notions of earth energies, of telluric
They
energies,
don't
of
want to touch it. They don't want to get close to it. They even in the face of literature and scientific research that identifies these on top of pyramids, on geoglyph landforms, and other temple bodies. This stuff
yeah,
is happening. They don't want
yeah.
to even go there, like it's
They don't want to.
really
They don't want to go
impossible.
there because they associate it in their minds. They've used. They keep using this term pseudoscience or pseudo archaeology,
Yeah.
and they regard themselves as the only people who've got a right to define what is or what is not pseudo archaeology. Actually, a lot of what is now current mainstream archaeology is, in my view, pseudo archaeology. But they choose to define any such idea that there might be energies in the earth which could be harnessed and mobilized for the benefit of humanity as absurd. But these ideas are not absurd, and they were not absurd to the ancients. They were
Yeah.
ideas that were very central to the thinking of the ancients. So when we look at the careful siting of many of these temple structures, we do find that they are at nodes and at the nexus of earth energies, and were indeed used. Part of their function was to promote the development of agriculture. And consider how many places in the world are referred to as navels of the earth. You
Hmm.
know, what's that? What does that mean? What does it mean, a navel of the earth? Consider the Temple of Delphi in Greece, and its omphalos. The Temple of Delphi is an ancient navel of the earth. Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean, Te Pitu or Tehenua, its ancient name means navel of the earth. Gobekli Tepe means navel, the hill of the navel. Angkor in Cambodia was a navel of the earth. There's so many of these places. It's almost as though the ancients created a grid around the world, a kind of anchoring system, and the key points on this network were called navels, navels of the earth. And they still bear those names to this day, and they turn out to be the most extraordinary and remarkable places.
One of the most famous stories, and you know exactly what I'm about to say, is that when Robert Schoch and John Anthony West were debating Mark Lerner, and Lerner goes, "There's no evidence. Show me the pot shards.
With the
Show,
pothead, yeah.
yeah." And I want to ask you about this because I'm uh, beginning to believe that these temples in Egypt, the pyramids, and many other buildings were so old that when the pharaohs or the pre-dynastics came and found them, they repurposed them.
Hmm.
I think this is a huge issue that needs to be looked at because a lot of these places, temples, sit on earlier temples,
Yeah,
and the
they do.
Egyptian authorities just don't want to use new technology. They're just hesitant.
Yeah,
It's a problem for them.
yeah.
You know what I'm talking about. What do you think about the idea that repurposing is a way to discover the ancient past?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to realize is that some of these sacred sites have been sacred for a very, very, very long time.
Yes.
Take the Great Pyramid, for example. We know that the Great Pyramid is built on top of a natural hill, the original primeval mound, in my view, and that cut down into the body of this natural hill, which is only about 30 feet high, is a long descending passageway that goes down to the subterranean chamber beneath the Great Pyramid. That passageway is about 300 feet long.
Right.
And it slopes, as all the passageways in the pyramid itself do, at an angle of 26 degrees, which, by the way, is half of the angle of slope of the exterior of the Great Pyramid, which is 52 degrees. None of this is accidental. And you can't walk upright down that passageway or any of the passageways except the Grand Gallery. You have to crouch. You have to kind of ape walk down them. It's quite uncomfortable and quite difficult. And in the case of getting to the subterranean chamber, that passageway is cut through bedrock all the way down to the bottom. And then you come into the subterranean chamber, which itself has a well in it of some kind of excavation inside it, and another passageway leading off it that seems to end. I've been into that little passageway. I've crawled right to the end of it, and it ends in a dead end. But then it leads you to question what may be beyond this. What more passageways and chambers are there underneath and within the Great Pyramid that we haven't found yet? And almost every year, new discoveries are being made. I mean, go back to 1872, and nobody knew that there were two so-called air shafts running out of the so-called Queen's chamber. I'm going to use the word so-called because we have no idea what the ancient Egyptians called these chambers or
Right.
what their original makers called them. We have no idea at all. But today they're referred to habitually as the subterranean chamber, the Queen's chamber, and the King's chamber. Now, it's been known since the 19th century, if not before, that the shafts from the King's chamber, one exits on the north wall and one exits on the south wall of the King's chamber, that they cut all the way through the body of the pyramid and emerge on the outside of the Great Pyramid. And this could be established and was established simply by rolling a cannonball down one of these shafts from the outside of the Great Pyramid. Somebody would climb up the Great Pyramid, find the opening to the shaft, put a little cannonball in there and roll it down, and sure enough, it would turn up in the King's chamber.
Wow.
This is true both of the southern and the northern shaft. But nobody knew that there were two similar shafts in the Queen's chamber because when that chamber was completed, they walled over the access to the shafts. And it was only an enterprising guy called John Wayman Dixon back in 1872 who noticed that there were two shafts in the King's chamber. And he thought, I wonder if there's something like that in the Queen's chamber. And he went around knocking on the walls and he discovered two hollow points, one on the north side, one on the south side. In those days, people could do what they liked with the Great Pyramid. There was a lot of vandalism, I'm afraid to say. And he just broke it through with a chisel and he opened up these previously unknown shafts.
Wow.
And for a long time, nobody knew where those shafts led because they don't exit on the outside of the pyramid. Then in the early 1990s, we have the first robotic exploration of those shafts, UPWOUT, run by Rudolf Gantenbrink. And what does he discover? That each shaft is actually blocked after a distance of about 170 feet by a door, and a doorway with two little metal handles.
Yeah.
What lay beyond that? Well, technology came up with an answer. We're going to drill through those doors and see what's beyond them. But what they found was an even bigger puzzle. 3 feet beyond the first door is a second door, and they still haven't figured out a way to get through that one. So it's like challenging us. This incredible monument is challenging us to explore it. It's challenging us not to accept simple-minded theories like this being the tomb of a megalomaniac pharaoh. It's challenging us to figure out why they went to all this trouble to create these features within the Great Pyramid. And almost every year we're finding more and more new features in the Great Pyramid. That huge space above the Grand Gallery that's been revealed by remote scanning in the last 5 or 6 years and still not entered. Looks like a second Grand Gallery exists inside the Great Pyramid. Another passageway lies above the original entrance to the Great Pyramid. Something is calling upon us. It's saying to us, explore me, find out about me, learn about me. Why am I using the angle 26 degrees and 52 degrees? Why do I incorporate the dimensions of the Earth in the height and the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid on a scale of 1 to 43,200, which is the case? Again, Egyptologists know this, but they say, oh, it's just a coincidence.
Do you believe it's a mechanism, Graham? Chris Dunn for years has been hypothesizing that it's an energy generator of some kind, but we don't know what.
No, Chris Dunn is an excellent researcher. I've known Chris since the early 90s, and I've got great respect for him, and he's done fantastic work. And he's looking at one particular aspect of the Great Pyramid, which is that it may have been some kind of mechanical device. But was it Obama who came up with that saying that I can walk and chew gum at the same time? I think the Great Pyramid walks and chews gum at the same time. I think it's got more than one function. I think it's got multiple functions. There's no doubt in my mind that one of its functions is concerned with a mystery that all of us are sooner or later going to confront, and that is the mystery of death and what happens to us after death. And the effects that the Great Pyramid has upon human consciousness are undeniable.
Yes.
I've had the privilege to be alone in the Great Pyramid, in total darkness, in silence, actually in the sarcophagus in the King's Chamber, and I almost immediately entered a visionary state. There's no doubt in my mind that something about that pyramid is designed to enhance and elevate consciousness. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't do other things as well. So I take Chris Dunn's work very, very seriously. I think it was a multifunctional structure, all respect.
It's likely to sit on an energetic geomagnetic field of some kind.
Yeah, definitely.
So it
sits on a navel of the Earth.
I have a close friend who actually leads our Mesoamerican tours, named Dr. Edwin Barnhart, who made a great statement about 2 months ago. He says we have about 1%, less than 1% of our knowledge about the Maya, and yet we write the books on it. And this is very, very telling, simply because any question about the Maya outside of the orthodoxy is pretty much put down. Why does orthodoxy have such a problem with the possibilities of an earlier epoch and the development of a high civilization?
Yeah, I think it's a very worrying situation that there is such closed-mindedness about the past, and that archaeology as an institution has such a conviction that they're right and that everybody else is wrong, and that they're the only people who are authorized to speak about the human past. This simply cannot be healthy. The human past is the possession of all of us human beings. It's our shared legacy from the past, and we all have a right to express our points of view and tell others what we think we know and what we found out about the past, and share that with others. And it's very unhealthy that a very small group of individuals, I mean, I suppose there might be perhaps in the United States 5,000 or 6,000 archaeologists, and those who are particularly active in putting down alternative points of view are even less in number, probably not more than a few hundred of them. And it's very unfortunate that they should have, such a dominant voice, such a dominant public voice within archaeology. And I don't think they're doing archaeology a good service, and I don't think they're doing humanity a good service by doing that. They would do much better by themselves and by the rest of us if they were a little kinder and a little more generous in spirit and a little more open-minded, a little more willing to consider that they actually could be wrong about things, that they could make mistakes. because we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. For a discipline to say we are right, we know the truth about the past, we absolutely know the truth about the past, that's really wrong, especially when so little of the world has actually been subjected to any kind of detailed archaeological investigation. And
Exactly.
when so much of the past has been lost, I mean, consider those 5,000 Mayan codices that were burnt by the Spaniards on a huge bonfire. Consider what was lost to the human race in that immolation of knowledge from the remote past. How can we possibly say that we know everything about the remote past when so much of it has been deliberately burnt and destroyed? How can we say that we, as they said in that Society for American Archaeology letter to Netflix, they literally said, we know that there was no lost civilization during the Ice Age. How can they possibly know that?
I
There's so
know.
much there's so much of the world that they haven't excavated. There's almost, yes, a little bit of work has been done in the Sahara Desert, but not very much. Not enough to have confidence that they know everything. But the Sahara Desert was green and lush and fertile during the Ice Age. And it should be if archaeologists are going to say they know everything about the past, they should have done a whole lot more work in the Sahara Desert than they actually have done. Now, I understand why little archaeology has been done there. It's very expensive, it's very remote, it's very difficult, but that's fine. But they then should not complain to have complete knowledge of the past, such complete knowledge of the past that they can write off any possibility of a lost Ice Age civilization. Same goes for the Sahara Desert's about 9 million square kilometers, by the way. Same goes for the submerged continental shelves. We know that sea level rose 400 feet, about 120 meters, with the ending of the last Ice Age. That led really the best real estate on Earth in that time, the coastal lands, to be inundated. The continental shelves that are now under as much as 400 feet of water were at that time above water and inhabited by people. And again, yes, there's been a little bit of marine archaeology done, but not enough at all to say that they know for sure that there was no lost civilization. There's 27 million square kilometers there that has not been properly studied. They're wasting too much time looking at shipwrecks from the 16th century and spending too little time looking at the submerged continental shelves. I'm glad that some work is now being done. The area that is called Doggerland between Britain and continental Europe has recently been recognized as an area that was richly inhabited during the Ice Age. And some attention is beginning to be paid at that. But we're looking at decades of work ahead before archaeologists can be sure about the past. So they shouldn't claim this certainty. The other area I frequently mention in this connection is the Amazon rainforest. And again, yes, there's been some archaeology done, but far too little for them to be certain about what's going on there. And there's at least 5 million square kilometers of the Amazon rainforest still covered by dense canopy rainforest, where almost no archaeology has been done at all. And the little archaeology that is being done is already producing fascinating results. So I think on the basis of all of this, that it's beholden upon archaeologists to stand back a little bit and to have less pride and less arrogance in their own knowledge, less certainty in their own knowledge of the past, and to be willing to consider alternative points of view, or at least to engage with alternative points of view without mounting ridiculous ad hominem attacks designed to smear those who they see as their opponents. And that's what they did in my case. They attempted to smear my name because they considered me, I suppose, to be a threat to their narrative.
You're too popular. You're too popular, Graham, is what it is.
Well, thank you. But there's too much narrative control in our society by different organizations, different institutions, different companies. There's too much of this going on. As a species, we need to learn to think for ourselves. And if we're going to think for ourselves, we need to have access to a wide range of information. And this is why I think researchers who are taking an alternative view of the past are playing a very useful and helpful role.
Talk a little bit about some of the prehistoric, I'm going to call that the term for discoveries. You brought up the Amazon, this soil, the Terra Preta soil. This is a brilliant soil that is so vital that it can practically grow anything. Talk a bit about that.
Well, Terra Preta, it's also known as Amazonian Dark Earth, ADE,
Yeah.
is an extraordinary invention of human beings in the Amazon. And this invention took place more than 8,000 years ago. We don't know how much more, could go back 10,000, 12,000, 15,000 years. We're
Yeah.
not certain yet, but it's at least 8,000 years old. And it was deliberately, the studies have now made it absolutely leave no doubt that this is a man-made, deliberately constructed soil, which was designed to open up areas of fertility within the Amazon. Rainforest soils by themselves are not particularly fertile for growing crops and so on. And that's why the burning down of the Amazon rainforest to create cattle ranches and soybean farms isn't a brilliant idea. Because those ranches and farms will only be viable for a few decades, and then they will cease to be viable. What the ancient Amazonian peoples did with the creation of Terra Preta was to create areas of fertility within the Amazon where crops could be grown. And we now know, and again, this is very recent knowledge, we now know that the Amazon was not simply a pristine rainforest inhabited by, simple hunter-gatherers. These were not simple people at all. These were people who had expert knowledge of the plants and the potential of the Amazon and knew what they could do. By creating Terra Preta, they made it possible for the Amazon to host populations of millions. This is something that was just inconceivable to archaeologists a few decades ago, but it can't be disputed anymore. The remains of enormous cities have been found in the Amazon, cities that were thriving until the time of the Spanish conquest. And it wasn't actually swords and guns that led to the ending of these cities. It was smallpox. It was the diseases that the Spaniards brought in to Latin America that decimated these cities. And of course, in cities in jungles, once the population dies out, within a century, the whole city has been overgrown and eaten up by the jungle and becomes invisible. And it's only with modern technology, particularly LiDAR, that it's become possible to recognize these huge centers of habitation that once existed in the Amazon, centers of habitation that were joined by straight roadways, sometimes more than 100 kilometers in length. There's a whole massive untold story just waiting to be told in the Amazon. I'd like to pay tribute to the work of Martti Paasinen from the University of Helsinki and Alceu Ramsey. Alceu Ramsey is a Brazilian geographer. They've worked together on beginning to reveal this untold story of the Amazon, and not only to do with the discovery that enormous populations lived in the Amazon, but also that they created giant earthworks, geometrical earthworks, enormous earthwork circles, a circle enclosing a square, rectangles, triangles. The whole exercises in geometry were being conducted in the ancient Amazon on a gigantic scale, expressing all of the geometrical ideas that we've been habitually attributing to the Greeks. They were being explored in the Amazon thousands of years before the Greeks. And it's a sad thing that the destruction of the Amazon is the reason why we know that these things exist, because the clearance of the forest revealed the existence of these, they call them geoglyphs now. They're rather similar to the Nazca lines in a way, aspects of the Nazca lines, but on an enormous scale, rather similar to the henges of Europe, like Avebury Henge here in England. We talk about Stonehenge. Actually, a henge is an earthwork. And if it's got a stone circle erected inside it, then it can be a Stonehenge. But essentially, a henge is a gigantic earthwork. And the gigantic earthworks that we find in Europe were preceded by these gigantic earthworks in the Amazon. And where stone was available in the Amazon, and it isn't available in every part of the Amazon, where it was available, they did also erect stone circles, such as at Rego Grande in northern Brazil. So there's a big untold story just crying out to be told in the Amazon right now. And again, I think it's required of archaeology to be more open-minded about this. And I want to make the point that in this case, it's archaeologists who are leading the way in revealing the truth about the Amazon. And other archaeologists should be more aware of what they're doing, of what these teams are doing in the Amazon, and more aware of of the implications it has for our understanding of the past. Whole areas of the world have just not been properly studied by archaeology. And the Amazon proves that when archaeology does roll up its sleeves and begins to study these areas, extraordinary findings are made.
You do make the good point that there are in America, before your most recent book, you show observatories, stone observatories in the Amazon. You also show megalithic structures. Why does the Orthodoxy have such a problem with diffusion, though? They thought that migrating people could come from the different oceans, land in the Americas, and perhaps settle and develop culture.
Yeah, there's a real prejudice against any notion of diffusion in modern archaeology, and that's weird because human cultures have been all about diffusion since the beginning of time. Human beings share ideas constantly. That's how human societies grow and flourish, is by sharing ideas, by learning from others, by teaching others all the time. This is what happens. And I think the other thing that's not properly understood is that ideas themselves can be carried by relatively few people who may not leave an archaeological trace. They may not leave a DNA trace, but they leave an idea trace. The same ideas keep cropping up again and again all around the world. And I often think that the best explanation for this is that they all share a remote common ancestor. It's not necessary to assume that people went from area A to area B carrying these ideas, that people went, for example, from ancient Egypt to ancient Mexico, or from ancient Mexico to ancient Egypt. It's possible that both ancient Egypt and ancient Mexico benefited from a legacy from a much earlier civilization. And this is an idea that I've explored in many of my books.
Right. Wonderful. As we conclude, I want to talk about one of the last programs that you feature on the ancient apocalypse, and this is this new site, Karahan Tepe. I've been looking at your work, but also Hugh Newman's research on the area, which is pretty spectacular.
Hugh and J.J. Ainsworth have done some excellent work on Karahan Tepe.
Yeah, I'm wondering, it seems like, I keep feeling, and I think you've mentioned this too, is this a reboot area where man comes out from the end of the Ice Age and is struggling, and these are learning centers? There's just a lot of strangeness about them.
There certainly is.
Yeah.
I think you put your finger on it. I think it is an attempt to reboot something that was destroyed during the Ice Age, perhaps not completely destroyed, a lost civilization from which there were survivors who passed down knowledge through the generations and eventually manifested it in sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. And then, having used those sites to mobilize the local hunter-gatherer populations, because they were all hunter-gatherers at the beginning of Göbekli Tepe, to mobilize them into activities that we would normally attribute to a high civilization within 1,000 years. They used these sites to do that. And then they deliberately buried these sites like time capsules to hide them away, to ensure that they weren't contaminated until humanity was ready to understand these sites again. And well, we're exploring these sites now. The only question is, are we ready for the message they have to teach us, for the truths they have to teach us about our past? And I'm not sure whether we're ready. The human race at the moment is full of terrible leaders, terrible governments, terrible corporations who are full of bullshit and lies, and who only seek their own profit and benefit. And who are even willing to plunge the world into nuclear war if it suits their objectives. Is humanity ready for this next level of message? That remains to be seen. But it's time we grew up as a species if we want to continue as a species on this beautiful garden of a planet.
Amazing. Graham, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. As we conclude, give me a hint, if you can, of what the pre-Diluvian people were like. Are they Homo sapiens sapien with a twist? Are they so focused on the earth that they are Homo sapien, but they are more tied in, locked in, plugged in, and able to understand the ebbs and flows of energetics of the planets of the solar system, so forth and so on. They're just a different kind of a human, more, for lack of a better word, more naturalistic.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were Homo sapiens sapiens, were anatomically modern humans like us, and that's because we know that Göbekli Tepe was made around 11,600 years ago, and by that time the Neanderthals and the Denisovans had become extinct. But we should never forget the legacy that anatomically modern humans owe to human species, like the Neanderthals and like the Denisovans. Fortunately, new research is beginning to reveal that the Neanderthals were not at all these shambling brutes that they used to be presented as, but were themselves symbolic creatures who created art. Homo sapiens sapiens were not the first species to make art. Neanderthals and Denisovans were. And then of course there was the interbreeding, so that many of us today carry Neanderthal and Denisovan genes. So anatomically modern humans are carrying within them a genetic heritage from earlier human species. And I believe they're also carrying a heritage of ideas. I think when we're looking at the possibility of a forgotten episode in the human story during the Ice Age, of a lost civilization, we shouldn't look for a civilization like our own. We shouldn't look for a civilization that was based entirely on materialistic concerns,
Right.
that was based entirely on production and consumption and machines and mechanical leverage and mechanical advantage. A civilization that deployed abilities within the human creatures that have been allowed to lapse by our civilization. I often get laughed at for talking about the possibility of telepathy and telekinesis in ancient civilizations. Actually, I probably don't devote more than a dozen pages to that possibility in all my books over the last 20 years. But whenever archaeologists want to attack me, they take those dozen pages and say, how come telekinesis and telepathy? Well, no, I don't, but I am interested in that. And I do know that human beings do have potential today, which we're not realizing. The work of Rupert Sheldrake has been fantastic in showing that telepathy does exist. Everybody's had the experience of telephone telepathy. You hear the phone ring, you know who's at the other end of the phone.
Yeah.
And it turns out that that's the person. You know, he's done work on dogs, telepathy in dogs. Dogs know when their owners are coming home. He did thorough scientific randomized experiments where the owners would come home at different times of day from different directions. Their dog would always know when they were coming home. There's some sort of attributed to high civilizations. There's evidence that they were present during the Ice Age. Who were they present among? This is what I've been looking for so long.
Real fun speaking with you. For those of you listening, you can go to grahamhancock.com, I believe, to get your material. Hancock. My next question is your lecture and event page on that too, where people can go and see you?
It is. Whenever I'm doing public lectures, I put them up on the talks and events page of the website. And I have a blog on the website. I've been very busy in the last few months and haven't done too many entries for the last few months. But there's, for example, that open letter for the Society for American Archaeologists and my response to it are on my blog. So I'd encourage people to take a look at that as well.
All right. Hey, thank you for joining me. Happy holidays to you and Santha. And
thank you.
Real pleasure having you on the program.